maybe this is really bourgeois of me, but we want fuller lives, and we want to know the meanings of the things that drive our lives. We want to redeem the garbage in our life. That seems to me, it's why I look at art. And the thing I feel when I look at Warhol is maximum redemption of lost material. He puts meaning back where there was deadness, I think. It's not that he reproduces a banalized, commodified experience, but that he puts something back into it. Color, sequence, gravity, iconic stature, gold. He puts all sorts of things back into it. He puts repetition and the pleasure of repetition, the pleasure of making one thing and then another and not discarding either one of them. He puts that back into human experience. And art took that out a long time ago when it separated the artists from the non-artists. And there were some who got to make pretty things and others who could at best be pretty things or buy pretty things. And Andy said, oh no, you can actually make them. You can be a non-artist who is the world's greatest artist. And that's why he's controversial. He is a non-artist. He's not an artist in a funny way. And he's the greatest artist. And that's why he matters, I think. That he's sort of Oprah language, he's empowering. You know, do it yourself. That's one of his paintings. I think it's a huge motto of his, to seize the means of production. But isn't that what the proletariat's supposed to do? And isn't that what Andy did when he made films? Everything he did seemed to be about seizing the means of reproduction. And it's a power move.
I love the generosity of Andy's work. And I look at it and I think that it's about playing God. It's about creating life. It's about that spark of trying to just, in the most economical means, to just get a little bit ahead of life itself. But I think Andy was really about finding grace and about sharing acceptance. You know, the art in Andy's work is about sharing where we are. It's like, you know, giving us our parameters and giving us more. It's that increase of really the possibilities. And for that moment, you know, he's a great alchemist. At that moment, we are greater than we've ever been.
So there's popping in out of cubism and collage, but it's because it's a master artist who sees this and understands it. It's the design that went into that in the manufacturing process is so exquisite, and it's just a pack of cigarettes. But if you really look at it, it's a master crafted art piece. In the 60s, the whole world became exposed like that. And that was the gist of what pop was in America here, that everything became art. Walking down the street, all of a sudden the fire hydrant is so beautiful, and you see it's connecting this with your life. And then when all the LSD stuff started going around, everybody got into the hallucinogen thing, you could see that the fire hydrant was alive. And it never goes away once you get it.
Girl, you really got me going. You got me so I don't know what I'm doing. Yeah, you really got me now.
Andy's ideas were brilliant, but not inexhaustible. Sooner or later, there's going to be a problem. You're going to fall into the classic trap of self-imitation. I'll do it like I did last time. And I think that he knew that. He understood that he had exhausted the vein that he discovered in pop art. That's why the film was so important for him, because it gave him a new place to take his visual and graphic genius. Stravinsky is said to have been asked once, what do you do when you run out of ideas? What do you do when you don't know what you're going to do next? And he answered, I wait. as an insect waits, and then jump. Andy waited and waited, and then something would happen, and he'd jump. And enough was happening all the time so that he had endless productivity. He was a demon worker, absolutely demon worker. One of the reasons he became an amphetamine addict was so he could stay up all night working. Not all night partying, working.
He was making movies nonstop, especially the Silver Factory. It was almost a 24-hour place. If Andy would go home, Undine and those people would still be there shooting up speed, making movies. You know, it was a very open, free-floating kind of creativity going on.
I mean, he was a lunatic in a way. He controlled a whole bunch of people in the factory. It was an extraordinary place. There must have been 15 or 20 people there. A lot of them on their way down destroyed people. And it was sort of a halfway house. And perhaps what drove Andy was really to be in that position, a voyeur, and to use these people for his art.
I call myself Candy Warhol now.
What's the film about?
It's called Blonde on a Bum Trip.
Are there any marbles?
What's it about?
It's one.
It's about a naive young lady who goes to Hollywood to make it big.
Andy was attracted to self-destructive people. Andy was attracted to addicts in a way. Andy liked people who were extremely one thing or another. He always said that he liked beauties and talkers. He liked people who looked good, or he liked people who could talk a lot and had these very sort of extreme personalities. They were the raw material of his films, of his art in that sense. But I think those people, burn out. Drag queens, I don't think, have the world's greatest life expectancy rate.
There were a lot of destructive people around. And they were destructive of others and destructive of themselves. It was going on constantly. And Warhol has been many times reproached with some justice for having let it happen. And he needed them, among other things, artistically. He needed them because he needed ideas. He was the receiver of ideas. He was not the generator of ideas. He was the receiver of ideas. Something would come by him and it would work for him. And he would do it. What he was trying to do was bring in the whole world until something hit and happened. He was receptive in a way that meant a kind of absolute openness to him. But sooner or later, it was going to have to get really hairy, and it did.
I'm a phony, well, so are you.
I think the narrative was, if you let in everyone, you let in madness too. And in it came.
Rowdy creep.
Get your hands off me.
I'll do violence, all right.
I suppose there's also the Jesus narrative that becomes more evident retrospectively. Looking backward from the Last Supper paintings through his assassination or near assassination, sense of Andy as martyr, scarified body, gunshot wounds. Also the sense that part of the Jesus narrative or the martyr narrative is a sense of Andy being a representative man who has to take on the sufferings of mankind, or whose plight is symbolic and universal, and that it's somehow altruistic for him to endure his tribulations because he's doing it for other people. That there's often a sense that Andy picked on others or abused others. I think the story is really more that Andy felt himself to be the martyr or the victim.
On the surface, Andy was so cool, so heartless, but I somehow sensed that underneath there was always this kind of pain, this ultra-sensitivity, this hypersensitivity, because he was so sensitive. He saw it all. He knew. He felt. He could read between the lines of what everybody was saying. I think it's like everything kind of came together in Andy, and it was a burden for him.
Do you want me to tell you about Andy?
Oh, go ahead.
Anything Andy does is fantastic because he's a saint.
A saint.
Yeah.
St. John the First.
He really loves people. So anything he does is beautiful because he sees the best in everybody. He sees God wherever he looks. and in whoever he looks at. So that's why they call it art, because he's just very good, you know. It's very pure. So they call it art. That's what they call art, and something just done with a touch of divinity.
Fudge.
One of the things that Warhol understood that a lot of great business people understand is you can't lead in America. You can't get up in front with a flag and make people go anywhere. What you do is you move to the edge, declare that the center, and let everybody reorganize the world around you. And in a sense, that's what Warhol did. He created a center that was on the edge, but basically the world would reorganize its way around it.
The end of January '64, Warhol found a new studio. He needed a different space. There's a simple entry in his day books where he kept a record of all his expenses. New studio, I think the date is January 24th or January 26th, and the address, 231 East 47th Street. This is the studio that became, or would become, the factory.
The factory, how to explain the impact of it, what it felt like, is really rare, something that probably hasn't happened in this century in the art scene. It was just the ultra salon, but in the days of acid trips, you know. It was high-powered lightning bolts, Velvet Underground, Andy Warhol, superstars, all in like a 3-year period. It was a peak. Anyone who came to New York from Europe, the Stones you gotta go to the factory, you know, or from California, Jim Morrison comes, you gotta go to the factory, you know. Someone would bring you to the factory if you were famous in any way. It was just the burner was always on.
The factory was a very porous social space. It's where Warhol worked, it's where he made his paintings, where he made his films, and it's also where he received people. It becomes the center, then, of his public life. And his public life includes his work life. And that's, I think, one of the great changes that's taking place right now is how Warhol totally gets the idea of sociability and art, that they're not exclusive operations, and how the social and the personal and the interpersonal permeate his art, as indeed I think they always have. Because I think his art was always about feelings, how people feel, how people respond, and how they respond to one another. The films certainly bring this into the foreground, bring this into high relief. And at the very beginning, he invites a young man named Billy Linick, who became known as Billy Name, to decorate the space, make it silver.
Somebody brought Andy over to this haircutting salon type thing that I was doing. And he was so taken by my apartment, he said, "Oh, Billy, I just got this big new loft space uptown. Would you do this to my new loft, you know, the silver thing?"
It was a perfect time to think silver. Silver was the future. It was spacey. The astronauts wore silver suits, and their equipment was silver too. And silver was also the past, the silver screen. Hollywood actresses photographed on silver sets. And maybe more than anything else, silver was narcissism. Mirrors were backed with silver. Andy Warhol.
In January 1964, armed with an industrial staple gun, rolls of aluminum foil, and dozens of cans of silver spray paint, Billy Linick got to work, devoting most of the next 4 months to transforming the dark and dingy industrial space, using his skills as a lighting technician to rewire the lighting system. Within a few weeks, the shy and quietly reliable Linick had taken up unofficial residence in the new space. For the next 5 years, he would serve as the factory's unofficial manager, custodian, and gatekeeper, sleeping at night in a makeshift nest in one of the 2 small bathrooms in back, while each day hosting a steady stream of flamboyant downtown friends, most of whom shared his love of grand opera wildly excessive gesture, and methamphetamine or speed.
I am always accused of bringing the criminal underground drug culture into the factory scene. And it's true, I did. Because Andy was sort of shy and careful about who he knew, but because I was competent, he trusted me implicitly to be able to control whatever situation I allowed to happen. And so I brought this element up to the factory with me. And Undine was probably the prime exponent of it because he was flamboyant and outgoing and I was very shy and behind the scenes type guy. But all of those extremes were these people that I knew from the village who were the mole people or the amphetamine people. And they were all brilliant.
Prominent among the factory hangers-on were a charismatic, non-stop verbal pyrotechnician named Robert Olivo, who called himself Undine, after the female lead in an experimental French play. A talented, desperately self-destructive dancer named Freddie Herco, and Bridget Berlin, the often abusively hot-tempered daughter of the chairman of the Hearst publishing empire. Over the next 5 years, thanks to Warhol's steadily increasing fame, the factory would gather in a cast of extreme characters from downtown, including a roster of drug addicts and drag queens, like Candy Darling, Rodden Rita, and Holly Woodlawn, a transvestite hustler who liked to describe herself as a disgrace to the world's oldest profession.
The thing that I thought was most interesting about it is that the dominant people in the scene were all of these working class drag queens. You know, you got Undine, you got Candy and these people, and yeah, they're drag queens, but they're also like working class dudes from Queens and Brooklyn, you know. The interesting thing, I think, you know, if you look at that crowd in the factory, very few products of American middle class culture. You got the top, you got the bottom. You got the drag queens, you got the flower children from, you know, Harvard and Stanford. And so that tonality of it was like really strange.
I don't really feel all these people are hanging around me, Warhol once remarked. I'm more hanging around them.
He had a great eye for talent. One of his many talents was spotting people. He would spot people that were interesting and powerful. And once he made a decision about them, you were in. That made these people who had spent most of their lives being rejected and treated as scum feel pretty good. They couldn't wait to gather around. It was the great good place. It was the other world where you could go and everything would be good. You could be a freak. You could be out of it. So he created this place where the misbegotten of the world could all gather and feel great.
I think in a sense, the factory was a microcosm of what went on in the 60s, the confusion, the anti-establishment marches, protests, the insistence of the individual, the sense of getting away from the normal. All of that was part of what Andy stood for. Excess, drugs, speed, except not by him, but by everybody around him.
Always hypersensitive to the effect of any drug, Warhol himself rarely took anything stronger than a diet pill called Obitrol. And even then, never more than a quarter of a pill a day. Though that was enough, he recalled, to give you that wired, happy, go, go, go feeling in your stomach that made you want to work, work, work.
I think that was really the period in his life where he just decided to redo himself utterly, and he became a whole different person. There were a lot of people in his life who he knew before that didn't fit into that world very well. I certainly didn't, and didn't want to. He was so different that it was as though he couldn't be his old self anymore. Carl Willers.
Little by little, as he moved further and further into the spotlight of his own increasing celebrity, the boyish, faintly elfin and open vulnerability of his younger days began to give way to an increasingly inscrutable public persona, modeled in part on the hip and sometimes sullen outward demeanor of Billy Lynnock's mole people.
I don't really
Once voluble enough, he rarely laughed or spoke in public now, and when he did, adopted a strange, emotionless voice that some compared to Jackie Kennedy's public speaking style.
I'm so empty today, I can't think of anything. Why don't you just tell me the words and they'll just come out of my mouth? No, don't worry about it because no, I think it'd be so nice.
At the same time, his studied insistence on his own shallowness now reached a new extreme. If you want to know all about Andy Warhol, he insisted, just look at the surface of my paintings and my films, and there I am. There's nothing behind it.
See, he was two different people. If you want to get really simplistic, there was the public persona and then there was a private persona. He always said he couldn't draw, okay? But he was a great draftsman at the same time. You know, he said he couldn't read or didn't like to read. He read all the time. He was a good conversationalist, but then in public, the screen went down and his persona that he created, this artwork of himself, comes forward.
And then you made, and then I made things like,
An effacement of personality, which was at the same time an assertion of personality. And he got that right away, because he was a very smart guy. You know, so if I pretend to have no personality at all, I'll be Andy Warhol. And that's more powerful. What you mustn't do is try to have a personality, put on an act, because I don't know how to put on an act. So put on no act. Just let it all fade away. And that worked for him. And it was a very interesting insight into the nature of the personality in a world of personalities and celebrities.
Nothing that had come before in Warhol's career could have prepared the world for the astonishing burst of creative energy that began to explode from the factory almost as soon as he took occupancy in the waning days of January 1964. From the start, the sheer size of the new space, nearly 5,000 square feet in all, made it possible to contemplate entirely new kinds of projects, faster in number and vaster in scale. And within days of moving in, he and his assistant Gerard Malanga were hard at work handcrafting 400 wooden sculptures, made to look as much as possible like ordinary grocery boxes.
You can look back at photographs of the studio when he's making the box sculptures in February and March of '64, only a month after he's been in the studio. And the box sculptures are laid out on the floor of the studio, lined up, box by box, on brown paper, being painted by hand and then silkscreened one at a time, and it looks just like an assembly line, looks like a factory. In fact, it's the first time where you really get a sense that what's still basically, of course, a cottage industry is being accelerated. The momentum's increasing, the quantity is increasing. It becomes much more like a factory. Between '64 and '68, he produces 3 times as many works as he does between '61 and '63, but his sense of the momentum is constant. Maybe it's just the quantities that are shifting. So many of the breakthroughs of what we think of as the breakthroughs are going on constantly.
That spring, as the first box sculptures rolled off the assembly line at the factory, dramatic proof came that his paintings had lost none of their power to create shock and outrage. Asked to create a giant mural for the New York State Pavilion at the 1964 World's Fair, he settled on a series of criminal mugshots drawn from the files of the FBI. The giant 20 by 20 foot multi-paneled silkscreen, called The 13 Most Wanted Men, had just gone up when on April 16, 1964, a week before the fair was to open, the architect Philip Johnson called to inform him that Governor Nelson Rockefeller himself had deemed the piece offensive and insisted it be replaced within 24 hours. When Warhol suggested replacing the mugshots with a giant image of the fair's president, Robert Moses, Johnson angrily dismissed the notion. In the end, Warhol had the mural painted over in silver. "That'll be my art," he said. Six days later, on April 21, 1964, Warhol's grocery boxes went on display for the first time. A huge crowd of curious onlookers lined up around the block, eager to see the show. You could barely get in, Robert Indiana recalled. It was like going through a maze.
Andy, a Canadian government spokesman said that your art could not be described as original sculpture. Would you agree with that?
Yes.
Why do you agree?
Well, because it's not original.
You have just then copied a common item.
Yes.
Well, why have you bothered to do that? Why not create something new?
Because it's easier to do.
Well, isn't this sort of a joke then that you're playing on the public?
No. It gives me something to do.
That night, Warhol threw open the doors of the factory for the first time and let the world in. With rock music blasting from multiple speakers and the dazzling glare of the red, white, and green spotlights Billy Linick had hung, glancing hypnotically off the silver walls, the loud and raucous event, the first of many that would help define the cultural ferment of the next half-decade, would be remembered by many people in attendance as the night the 60s began.
That's probably the first of the famous all tomorrow's parties at the factory. It really launches the factory as a different kind of space. Again, quintessentially 60s. High and low, high society, uptown, downtown, rough types, polished types. It mixed like carnival. Everything came together.
The soapbox show and the opening of the factory marked a crucial turning point in Warhol's career. If the crush of people at the Stable Gallery were proof that his fame was continuing to rise, many old friends were baffled by the sea change his personality had undergone in little more than half a year. Many more were baffled by the box sculptures themselves, and in the aftermath of the show, even longtime supporters like Ethel and Robert Scull began to back away, canceling their order of Brillo boxes. Warhol himself, though deeply wounded, refused to linger over the setback, taking instead the advice he would often give to other artists in the years to come. "Don't think about making art," he said. "Just get it done. Let everyone else decide whether it's good or bad, whether they love it or hate it. While they're deciding, make even more art." By then, Warhol had long since begun to take his own advice, moving in new directions and plunging into the artistic possibilities of an entirely new medium, which for the next 5 years would form the central focus of his artistic output, and which he would use to create some of the most radical and challenging artworks of the 20th century.
I remember coming to New York in the early 60s, and he said, "Irving, I've made a movie." And I said, "Really?" I said, "What's it about?" He said, "Well, I can't tell you. You have to see it." I said, "Okay." And he took me into a little viewing room, and he sat me down and left the room, and the image came on, and it was called Kiss. It wasn't titled, but it was about two people kissing, lips touching, and no movement, and no movement, and no movement. And I said to myself, I remember distinctly saying to myself, it's a slide. And he's testing me for one reason or another. But I was determined to sit, and I sat and watched, and no movement, and then the man blinked. And it was like a revelation. So, along with everything else, Andy was doing nothing less than reinventing cinema from the beginning and taking you through the whole process on his terms. How's that for a challenge? I think the movies are extraordinary, by the way, and I think they represent a really rich body of his activity.
The other way of thinking about the factory is the film factory, the dream factory. This is where Warhol is making his films. He's been making films since 6 months before, since the summer of '63. And it's quite clear that even before he's making films, he's thinking about making film. And there are techniques and structures in his early paintings of the '60s that are very cinematic and have a relationship to film.
The serious critics agree now that is where he finally had to go. He could not say what he wanted to say in sculpture and painting or sketches. He had to move to film, and that's the definitive work.
I think that there was an easy transition from being a graphic artist who worked in a still medium to be hung on a wall, to the very early films, Eat, Sleep, things of that sort. And it was particularly so for the Andy Warhol who went around saying, oh, it's so beautiful, and focusing on things that no one would notice. Maybe Chardin would have noticed somebody eating a mushroom and done a great painting. But most of us think, what the hell are we talking about? Someone's eating a mushroom, big deal. But to just turn a camera on that person and watch while that happens, actually just take it all in, was enough for Andy. And it was a visually very interesting thing to do.
As for what makes it art, is because it is a serious examination of the nature of existence. And those early films were very serious, the silent ones. If you say that art, sculpture, and painting studies the instantaneous, right? Space and the instantaneous in human experience, film is brought in to study the time dimension that men live in. Film will deal with that which reveals itself through time.
So Andy's first films were handheld camera. He went out and got a tripod, put the Bolex on a tripod, and basically said, I'm going to see what the camera does without interfering with it. So he would do the 3-minute rolls of 16mm black and white Tri-X portrait thing.
He said, I want to make a movie, so I will. I don't know how to make a movie, but I'll just make it. I'll film a guy sleeping. And, it turned out to be totally brilliant.
He made his first film in the summer of 1963, shooting hour after hour of his friend and sometimes lover John Giorno as he slept in the second-floor bedroom of his apartment on East 74th Street.
I've very often been struck with the fact that how rarely we are actually in a position to see the way a painter might see in a sustained way. For example, how rarely you get a chance to look at someone's face as a portraitist might look at a face for a minute or 2 or 3 or 4 without an exchange happening. Andy did that in film. And then I think with the first of his masterpieces among film, which is Sleep, he came up with a fascinating idea, which is what these films offer that paintings don't is literal clock time. There's no cutting, there's no jumping around in time, it just goes straight through. To look at someone asleep, which is in itself a very interesting and involving experience. How many people have looked at their children asleep and been completely absorbed in it? Found it a very fascinating and deep experience. Here is this person asleep, the poet John Giorno. And the camera looks at this in literal clock time. And what is it looking at? It is looking at the time in the day for all of us when literal clock time disappears. And we go into another kind of time, sleep time, dream time, in which hours and minutes are mixed up together. Now, that is what I call a stroke of genius. To stare at that hour after hour and know that what's going on is literal time disappearing inside the sleeper's mind is fascinating. Now, how many people want to sit and watch all 8 hours, or is it 6 hours of sleep? I cannot say. It won't be millions, I'll tell you. But nonetheless, it's an idea that is fascinating and brilliant.
I saw the show and the tension was just tremendous. It kept building up. It was
really?
a huge crescendo.
Oh.
People couldn't be still.
Was the screen nice? And I mean, is the movie house nice?
The movie house was nice. It was a large screen. The image was very large.
Oh.
About 12, 20 feet high.
Really? Oh.
And at one point, about 45 minutes after it began, some guy ran down from the audience, ran up to the screen, up the stage, and the ear was showing then.
Yeah.
And yelled in the ear, "Wake up!"
In all the early silent films of the period, Warhol insisted upon one basic departure from reality. Shot at the standard sound speed of 24 frames per second, the films were always projected at the slower silent speed of 16 frames per second. That minimal transformation, the filmmaker Jonas Mekas observed, was the mark of Warhol's genius. The one little choice that shifts the whole to a totally new angle, celebrating existence by slowing down our perceptions.
What stayed with me, I think, is a sense that gradually developed as I looked at his movies and at his paintings of a different relation to time. It's hard to explain, and it sounds abstract, but it's a physical experience that I have in front of Warhol's work. It's an experience of time altering. And I began to intuit that this was Warhol's experience of the world that he was reproducing in his artwork and allowing us to have access to.
But he was fascinated by anything in this world. You know, as he said himself, just the way the light is caught in a person's eyes and slightly moves. So he was able to watch for many, many hours, nearly still objects.
When he decides to do the Empire State Building had just prior to that been lit up for the first time. And, you know, in some ways, he saw the Empire State Building as a star. So right away, he's able to take this building, which is iconic. I mean, it's fantastic, right? It's lit up. He places it dead center in his screen. And then what does he do? He does the opposite of what you would think good movie making is about. He places this stationary camera and walks away. I mean, then there's the famous strobe cuts, the end of the reel and making that bright light. He makes it all visible. So instead of hiding those things, he uses those things. He makes them part of the art. And so in that sense, I think it's consistent with all the other work. He really reduces it to its basic elemental levels: time, subject matter, film, light. And in the process of reducing it, he opens something up completely different.
So he launched a series of living portraits. They're mistakenly called screen tests. They're not screen tests because no one is being tested for any movie. They are living portraits, and they're 3 minutes each of the person. And there's over 400 of them, perhaps 472, something like that, of these 3-minute breathing living portraits, I call them.
Anyone who came to the factory could have their screen test to be in the films. And it was just 3 minutes sitting in front of the camera where Andy would load the film in, focus it, and set the frame, turn it on, and walk away. And you were sitting there, it was up to you what you did. Usually people just sat still for like 3 minutes.
The screen tests, Gerard Malanga recalled, were studies in subtle sadism. The camera was located relentlessly 15 feet away. The recorded results were often brutal. I looked like a refugee from the Menninger Clinic, the actress Sally Kirkland said after seeing herself on screen. You sit staring at the camera, and after a while, your face starts to disintegrate.
I think they're riveting. You know, Empire, Sleep, screen tests. The early ones that Gerard Malanga, I think, calls stillies rather than movies, because they're usually of still imagery or haircut, barely moving things. They're riveting because, first of all, they have a lot of nude flesh in them, or a lot of sexual implications, so that they were incredibly tantalizing. You know, like one, which is, I think, his greatest film in many ways. You're looking for, I think it's 35 minutes, maybe it's 40, at this guy's face, and something is going on. You as viewer are both part of what's going on and not part of it. You know, it's like being God in a way. You're getting to spy on someone alone in his room. And there's just unparalleled voyeuristic delight getting to stare at somebody. There's also a kind of archival joy of, oh my God, here's 35 minutes of real 1963 time that's unnarrated, unmediated by the opinions of the moment. It's just naked time that I'm getting to look at.
So that first phase was like a brilliant set of consideration on the nature of literal time for the graphic eye. culminating in sleep, in my opinion. Then he reached the point where he started looking around saying, what am I going to do next? And he thought, well, here are all these people that are around me. Obviously, they should be in the movies. I should make them part of the movies. So there's a transitional film, or what I regard as a transitional film, called Haircut. And Haircut consists of simply a person set down on a chair and a sheet put around there, and then they do a haircut. And it lasts the duration of the film.
The haircut one is very powerful because it's an examination of power, right? Power and submission. So it's really an essay on really sexual dominance and sexual submission, emphasized by the person also just sitting and watching, just sitting there, often looking at the camera, because then you have this strange thing of you're watching somebody watching, right? You realize when it's over that you've learned an awful lot about how people submit and how people dominate, the power of the person with the scissors. And always that mysterious and never-ending source of ideas. The third person just sitting and looking at the camera. See, the point is to make you always aware that you're watching a movie, to stop that Hollywood thing that goes on, where you're sucked into it and believe it's true. The Warhol films never allow you to do that. To stop for 1 minute thinking that you're looking at a film. To stop that is to make the audience aware that there is no one watching this person except themselves. So you become aware of yourself all the time as perceiver.
I think that there is in Andy a very powerful drive to look, not touch, to see and not connect. He retains his passivity. He is the opposite of the director. He's the anti-director. He is not trying to create his vision, not trying to make it happen on the screen. He's trying to let it happen on the screen. And that involves him withdrawing from actual direction altogether into a pure visuality, or a purer visuality, the kind of a look but don't touch distance, which is also very near, which for most people doesn't happen very often. That voyeurism, which I'm sure was part of his psychology, a deep part of his psychology, drove him always. That is, for Andy, the notion of eros, of sexuality, also was, I suspect, a lot of look but don't touch. He was someone who intensely disliked being touched. So he wanted to create a distancing space around himself, which was the only way he could be close, safely close. And I think that that worked beautifully in the early films, because it is exactly what they do too.
Andy didn't want to be the one in front of the camera. Andy wanted to be behind the camera. He wanted to record other people's bodies as stand-ins for his own. And so, absolutely, the axiom of Andy Warhol is that every beauty, every image is Andy. And that Andy did not make images of ugliness. Everything is a face. Everything is a beautiful face. Even if it's urine stains or a Coke bottle, it's in some level a human face, as beautiful, as desirable.
Andy became famous by making other people famous. You know, I mean, we're talking Mr. Passive Aggressive here. We're talking passive aggression at the level of genius. He made people famous, and then he became famous for making people famous. Andy didn't really ever present himself as a star. He presented himself as a star maker. But I mean, but how shrewd. He created a factory, he made himself the boss. He wouldn't pay anything into anybody. It was supposed to be fun. And what was the fun is that, if whatever kind of sex you wanted was available there, whatever kind of drugs you wanted was available there. So in a sense, he was sort of fueling his own career, with the darker impulses of the people that came in there.
Of all the figures pressed into service over the next 5 years, as Andy Warhol's on-screen surrogates or stand-ins, none would play a more crucial role in the complex and increasingly volatile atmosphere of the factory than the succession of on-screen alter egos he called superstars. Troubled souls, for the most part, drawn from the retinue of rebellious socialites, aspiring actresses, fashion models, and drag queens, pulled into the orbit of the factory by his growing notoriety.
And he had just bought the Oricon Sync Sound 16mm camera because he wanted to go into sound, because at that point, silent films would no longer say what he had to. But he felt that silent films now were a block of work that said what he could with silent film. And now he wanted to go into sound, the next step up. And he wasn't sure what he was going to do.
From there, it was a very short step to suddenly saying to the factory freaks, do something on the screen. Not just sit there, do something. Don't just sleep, don't just eat, don't just hold still, but do something. And to do something, you have to give them a suggestion. And this is where Ronnie Tavel came in. And he said, all right, I will give these crazies something to do. I will write scripts for them, and they will perform it on camera. And he got Andy, and he proceeded to make the films of the second phase happen and possible.
The new superstars Warhol's sound films would create were real, one man later said, not hidden behind the protective veneer of acting out a character created by someone else.
There were a few people used who were trained actors. So you basically get non-professionals, who are interesting to look at and who will reveal themselves in some way. Non-actors can be even more interesting than professionals, because now we'll have the real person. The screen can capture the real person and directly revealing human nature rather than through a character.
I mean, at one level, it was like a Judy Garland movie. Hey, let's all do a show. You know what I mean? But it was like the X-rated version of a Judy Garland movie. Hey, I'll make the sets. We'll just go naked. We won't wear costumes. I mean, it was like, it had that aspect to it, and it was fueled by amphetamines, which again makes one probably more verbal than one would normally be, and fueled by the anxiety of sort of sexual confusion.
I think that the people who gathered around Andy in the factory looked at him and said, here is this scared, shy, poor, miserable, talented, interesting guy who's made himself one of the most famous people in the world. And he is going to do the same for me. We'll all be redeemed. I am not the miserable, scared loser that I felt like most of my life. I'm actually gonna be a star. I'm going to have it happen because this guy has figured out how to make it happen for people like me. He's figured out how to do it. He has the magic touch.
The people I loved were the ones like Freddie Herco, the leftovers of show business, turned down at auditions all over town. They couldn't do something more than once, but their once was better than anyone else's. They had star quality, but no star ego. They didn't know how to push themselves. They were too gifted to lead regular lives, but they were also too unsure of themselves to ever become real professionals.
By the summer of 1964, Warhol had become an orchestra conductor of extreme possibilities, Jonas Mekas declared, and the impresario of 20 or so sad, frustrated, unfulfilled, outcast, egocentric underground stars on the brink of waiting to be used. Andy was like the Marquis de Sade, Emile de Antonio observed, in that his very presence acted as a kind of release for people, so they could live out their fantasies, get undressed, or in some cases do very violent things to get Andy to watch them. He was able to bring that out in a lot of people, doing weird things in his early films who wouldn't have done what they were doing for money or D.W. Griffiths or anybody else.
And Andy is making them the center of things, and there's a kind of social inversion that's going on. But somehow out of that, Andy was able to generate a lot of product. I mean, the appeal of it was so shrewd. You know, you've got all these nice, cute, face-lifted society ladies in there, and all of these drag queens, and all of these hustlers, and musicians, and it was so attractive. And whenever anybody came to town, they'd always have to go there. You know, and he created this kind of Grand Central Station. You know, it's kind of dystopian Grand Central Station. A lot of people died, you know, and a lot of people had their hearts broken forever and ever. And, I mean, you know, you cannot construe it as being nice, but it was really a rough democracy, you know.
In October 1964, the factory registered its first casualty when Freddie Herco, convinced he could fly, danced out of an apartment window, high on speed, and plunged to his death.
He was just dancing and danced right out the window on Cornelia Street. And Biden and Andy said, gee, isn't it too bad we weren't there to shoot it? I turned frigid when I couldn't believe somebody would say this, and people have criticized me and said, well, didn't you understand he's speaking about the aesthetics of somebody dancing out the window and killing themselves? And I think I have a right to say, no, wait a minute. There is a line that you don't go beyond, and this man does not know that line.
I don't think he was really a bad person. I think he did some awfully bad things, you know. I think like anyone, when Andy suddenly found that he had acquired the stardom that he was mimicking, which is what he was doing, it is hard to undergo that moment in which you find that you can make people do things and you're kind of drunk with your own power. And I think there really was a period in the 60s in which Andy indulged himself. But, I mean, you talk to his brothers, you talk to anybody, most people loved him. Most of the people that worked the factory loved him. I mean, there are people who hate Andy, and quite a few of them, but not many people whom I have met who knew him disliked him. A lot of them disliked his parsimony and his manipulativeness. But he was genuinely, you know, a river under his people, you know. I mean, he had a lot more to give than he took.
If somebody wants to be in movies, you can buy their life and say, we'll do 2 movies of your life for that year, or 3 or 4 or 5, depending on how interesting that person is. If their life is interesting enough, they can go on forever.
In '65 at the Silver Factory, the tempo took a change when Edie Sedgwick came in from Boston with her Harvard clique and to be the new girl of the year. Jane Holzer was really the first girl of the year, and she got coverage about that. But Edie came in at like this angel out of a cloud of blue, just with the lightning strikes around her. She was so poised, such a director and actress at the same time. She had this poise of complete composure, and when she walked into a room, everyone was on point.
I think it's sheer beauty. She had sort of a gamine look, very long legs, very pale face, very pale lips, and a waif in a way. Time sort of stopped when you were with her. I think she may have been the very first of the great superstars. And she came to New York And Andy Warhol took a look at her at this Lester Persky party and fell in love with her.
Of all the superstars drawn into the orbit of Andy Warhol's career, none would match the brilliance with which Edie Sedgwick blazed across the firmament of the factory in 1965. From the very start, the ravishingly beautiful, deeply troubled 22-year-old heiress held a special fascination for Warhol, with her pale good looks, aristocratic pedigree, and restless, drop-dead charm. With a deeply addictive personality and family shadows that included a predatory father and two brothers who had killed themselves less than 10 months apart the year before, Sedgwick had more problems than anyone I had ever met, Warhol said. Gerard Malanga called her the personification of the poor little rich girl.
She was an enchanting creature. I helped do a book on her, really to find out why, at the age of 28, she died. The girl with everything on her way, this amazing beauty, very gifted in a funny way, an artist, could have been a good actress, I think. But then she got tied up with Warhol, and of course for Warhol it was a great thing to have this creature to take around. She sort of became at his side all the time. They went to parties together.
What happened when he met Edie Sedgwick was that he saw her as his ticket to Hollywood. That was very clear. And he wanted me to write scripts that more and more were Hollywood films to show off her talent so he would be bought by Hollywood and make Hollywood movies. His only dream that he was never to fulfill.
Oh, wow. Great.
Their first film effort together, a one-character piece starring Edie as herself, was called Poor Little Rich Girl.
Most beautiful coat in the world.
Though half the film was out of focus, Edie's charisma shone through anyway, and her career as an underground film star was launched. For their next project, Warhol asked Tavel to write a new script for Edie. Something in a kitchen, he said. Something white and clean and plastic. The result was Kitchen. In the film, Edie and her mostly male co-stars drift around the pristine kitchen of a studio apartment, chattering all but inaudibly, thanks to the poor quality of the sound. It ends when one of her co-stars, for no apparent reason, strangles her on the kitchen table, while the rest of the party look on. In what would prove to be in many ways her best film, Beauty Number 2, Sedgwick could be seen sprawling nearly naked on a bed with a handsome young man, while from the darkness off camera, an unseen man lays siege to her with a series of increasingly personal and hostile questions.
What do you mean? Say that again. What do you keep asking me what I mean for? You know damn well what I mean. I don't know what you mean. What do you mean? Why would I say, what do you mean, if I knew what you mean?
And it was electric. And the extraordinary thing about the film was that there was the third actor, this sort of voyeur figure, very much in a way like Andy, you know, the voyeur watching these two beautiful people on this bed, this boy and this girl. And she was very much drawn by him, but also drawn by these terrifying questions being put to her by the man in the foreground, Chuck Wine, his name was. And they were very personal questions.
How does that sound, Edie? I'll wake you up tomorrow. We'll find another doctor. You can read. I've got
Beauty Number 2, in many ways, was the high point of Edie Sedgwick's career. By the time it premiered on July 17, 1965, to glowing reviews that certified her status as the queen of underground film in New York, her relationship with Warhol had already begun to sour. She often talked about trying to get close to Andy, a mutual friend reported, but she never could get close to him on an emotional level. Money, too, became an issue. Though the film seldom made a profit and had to be subsidized by the sale of Warhol's paintings, Edie grew increasingly resentful of his refusal to pay her for her work. Egged on by her friends, including Bob Dylan's right-hand man, Bobby Newworth, with whom she would soon start a passionate affair. It was the beginning of a bitter tug of war between the Warhol and Dylan camps, which was still going on the day Dylan himself sat for 2 tense screen tests at the factory 6 months later. By then, Edie herself had started the long spiral down into darkness and drug abuse that would end with her death 5 years later.
By the time I came along, she had come back from Woodstock a heroin addict, and there wasn't much you could do with her.
And I think Andy knew that too, and that it was the beginning of the end. Many dreams were dying for him, that he'd keep trying with her, but he knew she wasn't going to take him to Hollywood. And in fact, every day she was heavier and heavier into drugs, so she couldn't, aside from not making Lawrence work, couldn't remember anything anymore.
When Edie Sedgwick started going into the outer darkness, Andy Warhol did not try and bring her back. Or if he did, it was a pretty ineffective gesture. So that's a factor that one must weigh along with the greatness and the brilliance and the talent and all the rest. His, I have to say it, his responsibility to these people who came into his world. Edie Sedgwick, because she came from a socially prominent family, ended up not dying in the streets exactly, but dying terribly at the age of 28. 28. That's just the beginning of life for most people. She looked like this bedraggled, wretched has-been at the age of 28. It was horrifying. It was sickening what happened. It was sickening what happened to a large number of people who were wrapped up in that dream.
Even as the chaos of the factory intensified, Warhol's creative energies continued to soar upward. In the fall of 1965, he announced he was leaving painting behind entirely to focus on a new series of projects involving music, dance, performance art, and film, and a rock and roll group he had recently been introduced to called the Velvet Underground. On October 4th, to mark his farewell to painting, he released the first in a series of helium-filled silver balloons from the roof of the factory and watched them float away into the ether above Midtown Manhattan.
Oh, it's beautiful. It really is. Oh, it's infinite because it goes in with the sky. Oh, it is fantastic. This is one of the most exciting things that's ever happened.
It was the beginning of what would prove to be the most creative, chaotic, and fateful period of his entire career.
We went from Edie Sedgwick to multimedia happenings, and the exploding plastic inevitable. We had just hooked up with the Velvet Underground, and Andy was starting to promote them and sponsor them, and we had this great idea of doing a multimedia show. Instead of just simple films, we would have the Velvet Underground performing on stage. We will have, before that, shot a film of the Velvet Underground and Nico, which we did at the factory. And while they're performing on stage at the Cinematheque, we'll project the film on them and the background and have multiple films going. And then we progressed to more where we started using strobe light explosions, and then Paul brought in the plop, plop, plop doodle projection thing, the scrambled eggs or whatever it was. And we eventually ended up at the Dome with the exploding plastic inevitable.
On Friday, April 8, 1966, Warhol's multimedia happening, The Exploding Plastic Inevitable, opened at the Dom, a one-time Polish community center on St. Mark's Place. By 8 p.m., a crowd of nearly 1,000 had gathered in the garishly lit main ballroom. On stage, as strobe lights flashed blindingly, Lou Reed and John Cale of the Velvet Underground blasted away at top volume, while Nico stood in front, a strange Norse goddess, singing in her ethereal voice. Gerard Malenga, studded in leather armbands, lifted dumbbells and cracked a long whip, and using a ballpoint pen, pretended to inject himself with heroin. Ondine and Bridget Polk, meanwhile, moved through the crowd, giving friends and acquaintances real injections of amphetamines through their clothes. Above it all was Warhol himself, standing on the balcony, projecting silent films on a whitewashed wall behind the band, using light filters and slide projectors to throw ever-shifting colors and shapes on the walls of the hall's interior. Watching him, the filmmaker Jonas Mekas saw a kind of mystical impresario, or sorcerer, structuring with temperaments, egos, and personalities, who maneuvered it all into sound, image, and light symphonies of tremendous emotional and mental pitch. somewhere in the shadow, totally unnoticeable, but following every second and every detail of it. We all knew something revolutionary was happening, Warhol himself declared. We just felt it. Things couldn't look this strange and new without some barrier being broken.
What he succeeded in doing most of all, and probably the hardest thing to do, is to encapsulate a moment. And he did that. When you think of the 60s, when you think of how varied that time was, and when you think of, say, for example, this country prior to that time, I mean, music was ding, ding, ding goes the trolley, as I recall. You know, I mean, everything changed. Everything changed. And Andy, absolutely in the center, watching it, recording it, adding whatever he was able to add, one insight after another. I think, to this day, remarkable.
We were in the back room of Max's Kansas City, where he always held court, right? And he waited for the whole crowd to leave the table and go off and dance or fool around. And then he just picked up a napkin and he drew a line in the middle of it, dividing it in half, and wrote B on one side and white on the other. And he said, I want to make a movie that is a long movie, that is all black on one side and all white on the other. And do you understand? And I said, yes, right. That was to become Chelsea Girls. I saw right away that something like Kitchen and Shower, these are white films, and Edie is white and silver. Vinyl, certain of the screen test things, these are black movies, right? The sadomasochistic ones. And that they would be juxtaposed on a double screen using 2 projectors.
Shooting on the film's 12 unrelated scenes began in June 1966 and went on for nearly 4 months in the dimly lit interiors of a rundown retreat on West 23rd Street called the Chelsea Hotel. Warhol completing an average of 1 33-minute sound reel a week, some in color, some in black and white, with nothing for the factory regulars to go on, beyond the few sketchy scenes Tavel had provided.
You filthy horror! How dare you! How dare you! I'm a phony? Well, so are you. So are you, admit it! Stop it! Admit it, you! Admit you're a phony, you creep! Get your hands off me! My hands are off you for all time, you lousy creep!
Get your hands off me.
In the end, Warhol and Morrissey assembled the 12 most striking scenes they had shot into a single 6.5-hour-long sequence, then cut the running time in half by projecting 2 reels at a time, side by side, one in color, the other in black and white.
I'm sorry, but that's a autistic bore. Little Miss Phony. I hit you with my festered hand, you dumb bitch.
Chelsea Girls is, I think, plainly the most brilliant and successful and artistically important of all the films, without any doubt, because it is a really successful synthesis of the 2 aspects of Andy's genius. One, what was happening with these crazy people, and a way of integrating it not into narrative, for which he had no gift at all, but into his graphic genius. And that is the dual screen and the projectionist as a kind of orchestra director. I think that was a genuinely dazzling idea. Visually dazzling, artistically dazzling, and a wonderful way of incorporating all of these people into a coherent work, built exclusively upon what Andy did like no one else could do, which was arrange the visual scene. And that, therefore, it makes it his best film. The idea of having the camera be witness to the weirdness of his characters, of these people, worked there as it never worked again as well, and never worked before as well. It's a genuine achievement, and I think it will be a lasting contribution to the whole history of film.
December 11th, 1966. It has come time to wag the warning finger at Andy Warhol and his underground friends and tell them politely but firmly they are pushing a reckless thing too far. It is time for permissive adults to stop winking at their too precocious pranks. It is particularly important to put a stout spoke in Mr. Warhol's wheel. Bosley Crowther, The New York Times.
As 1967 began, Warhol began handing out a simple piece of advice to anyone who asked. Do everything, he said. The success of the previous year, culminating in the Dom concerts and Chelsea Girls, had enlarged his ambition still more. I felt so good about things, like we could do everything, he later recalled. I wanted to have a movie playing at Radio City, a show on at the Winter Garden, the cover of Life, a book on the bestseller list, a record on the charts. And it all seemed feasible for the first time.
And in the mid-60s, at the factory, we were steering American culture in the popular arts sense. And the feeling of that was there. We could feel the power. We knew exactly we were at the pinnacle of this great wave. And we were so it.
He was so popular that I remember on one occasion he got a double to be him. Amazing story. He got this fella, somebody, I think he, at the factory one day, somebody said, Andy Warhol's got a speaking engagement out in Wisconsin. Would you like to be Andy Warhol? So this fella went out to Wisconsin, got a sort of a makeup on so he looked vaguely like Warhol, and got away with it until he went out to some place when the airplane landed. There was a windstorm or something. It blew up off all his makeup and his hair. So he was found out. And then, of course, he got into the papers, you know, got into Newsweek and Time. Andy Warhol's fake, his doppelganger.
But it couldn't go on. The dream of this great good place that will always be good, everything will be great. All these drugs and all these beautiful, strange, weird people and all the ways in which the incompetence of these talented people was forgiven. It was all fine to be just who you are, the wreck that you are, you know. All of that got challenged when sooner or later one of them had to be destructive. I mean, really destructive.
Whatever comes along. Like somebody called up yesterday, a girl, and she said, I have a script called Up Your Ass. And I thought the title was so great, and I was so friendly, I just told her to come up. But she still, you know.
Andy was vulnerable. He didn't have defenses. Like I said, the factory was always open to anyone who came in and wanted to play with us and become a part of us, and if they could, they could. You know, we didn't have any stipulations, you gotta be this or do that. They came in and they fit, and you know, Valerie Solanas was one of them who found her way there.
As his reputation grew, an increasing number of strangers began showing up at the factory, along with an increasing number of unsolicited manuscripts. So many, in fact, that almost no one took notice one morning in early 1967 when a new play by an unknown writer turned up in the incoming pile of mail. An incendiary diatribe called Up Your Ass. It was the work of a deeply troubled 30-year-old writer named Valerie Solanas, who, forced to scratch out a living turning tricks in the East Village, had recently embarked on a campaign against the entire male sex, writing a blistering anti-male manifesto, and founding a group called Scum, the Society for Cutting Up Men, whose only member was herself.
She was an angry person, and she had to turn tricks, you know. And I think it's one of the reasons she came to hate men even more. And she had to go through that whole period of street living, selling herself just to be able to get a place to stay.
At their first meeting, he told her that her work was so obscene, he had initially feared she was an undercover policeman, trying to entrap him. Sure, I'm a cop, Solanas replied, pulling down the zipper of her pants. Here's my badge.
It was very simple. Valerie wanted to be a great writer, and she had written a play, an absolutely unproducible, insane play. And Andy read the play, or someone around him read the play, and either he or someone around him said, "Oh, this is good, Valerie. We'll do a movie of it sometime."
And he kept promising her that, oh, I'll get it to the right people, or I'll make it into a movie. He hated to say no, Andy, and that sometimes got him in trouble because she was counting on him and her insanity to actually make this into a movie, and it was this ultra man-hating manifesto. And he just put it in a drawer, and I don't even know if he showed it to anybody.
They were never going to do a movie of it. And at a certain point, Valerie figured it out, that it wasn't ever going to happen. And she was someone who could not handle that challenge to that fantasy. She simply couldn't live with it.
As the summer of 1967, the summer of love, turned to fall, a new mood began to spread across the country. As the war in Vietnam dragged on, once peaceful protests began to give way to angry demonstrations and confrontations with the police. Increasingly now, racial unrest exploded into violence on the streets of major cities, where every sign of urban decay, from drug use to white flight, was on the rise.
When you walked in the factory, there was a sense of peril, with Undine shooting up down in the back, with Rona having a tantrum, or Irene Nicholson clawing Andy, saying, "You have to marry me, you have to," you know, all these crazy people. And Henry Geldseller stopped coming over after a while, and Jane did too, because it was a little disturbing for her, because she needed attention, you know. And with Undine and Bridget around, those monsters would just, with their tongue, tear people apart.
You're dealing with people that were unstable to begin with. And then you provide a situation in which they use very dangerous drugs and hallucinogens, or even amphetamines, which are going to drive people over the edge.
Lou Reed actually said something. Lou said, you know, so there come a point in that world where if you don't want to die, you've got to be hip enough to be square. And there are a lot of dead people that weren't hip enough to be square.
The year before, another factory regular, Danny Williams, had left a pile of clothes on the beach and disappeared into the sea. And with each passing month now, the psychic toll of the factory seemed to be on the rise, exacerbated by drug use, angry infighting amongst the regulars, and rising anger at Warhol himself.
I think you're right. I mean, I think everyone that was close to Andy ended up having very ambivalent feelings. It almost always developed into a love-hate thing. Because, you know, you started off feeling inspired by Andy and ended up feeling used. Because he really sucked you dry.
More and more, behind Warhol's back, factory regulars took to using the nickname Undine had coined for him. Drella, a contraction of Cinderella and Dracula. At once the ragged stepsister who transforms herself into a princess, and the bloodthirsty vampire who sucks people's blood.
There's a moment of revulsion. There really is. And I can understand that. When you're writing about somebody as strong and as troubling and as powerful as Andy was, as a writer, at a certain point, you wake up one morning and you go to the desk and you say, I hate this son of a bitch. This is a really disgusting human being. I went through real revulsion. Now, I don't feel that still, but I went through a phase of it. And I can tell you what disturbs me, which is you watch people around you that you've made promises to and who are there because they are thrilled to be around you. And they are killing themselves. And you don't do a damn thing about it. Nothing. Maybe you can say, I can't save them, but you try. You think about trying. I don't think that Andy did. I think it was a price of his passivity that he didn't really try.
As the mood in the factory turned increasingly uneasy, Warhol began getting angry phone calls from Valerie Solanas, enraged he had not made moves to produce or film her play, and insisting he return the manuscript she had sent.
And so she now started calling about, I want my script. I'm going to come over and get my script. And we couldn't find it. So in her paranoid psychosis, anger thing, she decided that we actually tricked her into leaving the script, and we're saying we lost it until she forgot about it, and then we would use it for a film. You know, like we even cared about doing anything like that. But it would never have come about that we would have done her stuff, and she wasn't aggressive enough to make it happen.
When Warhol admitted misplacing the play, she demanded $25 to help pay her rent. He refused, then suggested she could earn the money by acting in one of his films, I, a Man, shot in August 1967, turning in what everyone agreed was an impressive performance. But her resentment only intensified. In October, she was evicted from the Chelsea Hotel for failure to pay back rent and took to the streets. Increasingly adrift now, she became obsessed with the idea that Warhol was conspiring with her publisher, Maurice Gerodius, to steal and exploit her work.
When Andy or someone around Andy said to someone like Valerie, who had felt miserable about being Valerie Solanas her whole life long, we're going to make your play. It's going to be a movie. She thought she had been told, again, we're going to make you a star. The light had shone on her. She was going to heaven too, right? And when she figured out that it was a lie, she cracked. It was unbearable for her.
By early 1968, as the end of its lease approached, the disintegration of the silver factory was growing obvious. Increasingly now, Billy Name, who had carefully maintained the place for years, let the tinfoil peel off the walls. When the search began for a new space, Paul Morrissey chose the location himself, ignoring Billy's advice to rent a large, flexible open space, much like the original factory, settling instead on a series of offices on the 6th floor of 33 Union Square West. In early February 1968, the contents of the factory were moved to the new space, a brightly lighted suite with white walls and oakwood floors. No one was sure exactly what the future would hold, but it was obvious that the old factory, the legendary silver factory of the 1960s, was gone forever.
I can't tell you exactly when the change occurred, but my guess is late 60s, post the shooting, I think. You know, he was so accessible and so available, anybody could go to the studio until this madwoman nearly did him in. Valerie Solanas was her name, and she thought Andy was obliged to make her a movie star. Andy didn't feel that way. But that was her thinking, and as a result of his not coming across, she shot him.
I think that there was a way in which he had courted this problem in all his work from the depths of his being, and it came home. I don't think that it was possible for him ever really to say, I didn't do this. I think that he understood that because he was a very smart guy, that in some ways he had let Valerie into his life, and by being Andy Warhol, he created for her a disappointment that she could not live with, literally could not live with. She had to do something. It was kill or be killed.
On the morning of June 3rd, 1968, Valerie Solanas resolved to put an end to the tormenting feelings that had been raging inside her for months. Dressed, despite the warmth of the late spring day, in a thick turtleneck sweater and heavy winter coat, and armed with 2 automatic pistols concealed beneath her outer garments in a brown paper bag, she went first to the Chelsea Hotel on 23rd Street, looking for her publisher, Maurice Gerodius. Gerodius wasn't there, and after waiting in vain for nearly 3 hours, she headed east towards Union Square and the factory.
This is one of the tacky things that happened to Andy. He was even second choice to be assassinated. Gerodius, her publisher, was the first thought she was going to get. She went over to the Chelsea Hotel with the gun, and he wasn't there. She waited all afternoon, and he didn't come in because the factory was relatively close. We're in Union Square. She said, Gerardus, he isn't going to show up. Well, I'll go get Warhol.
She shot him because somebody else she wanted to shoot wasn't home. And when she finally realized he might not be there, she sat in front of the office to shoot Andy. She was going to shoot somebody that day.
Up in the factory, Paul Morrissey greeted her with casual contempt, brusquely telling her Warhol wasn't coming in. A lie, since he knew Warhol would be coming in later in the day, then curtly asked her to leave. Stymied again, Solanus headed back downstairs and waited on the street.
I was there at the office. It was a Friday, I think, and she kept coming up from 1 o'clock on, and she said, when's Andy coming? I said, he won't be in today. Come next week. And then she came back up 2 hours later. Where's Andy coming? I said, no, I told you he's away for the week. She came up 3 times.
She was still waiting on the street below when at 4:15 p.m., Warhol pulled up in a cab with his new assistant and boyfriend, Jed Johnson, in tow. Solanus chatted with the 2 men affably, then followed them into the elevator and rode with them up to the 6th floor, where Fred Hughes, Billy Name, and a sheepish Paul Morrissey greeted them as they spilled out onto the factory floor.
She had a raincoat on, and I said, now, Valerie, you caught me making up a lie. I'm sorry, but now I'm going to have to force you to leave because I can't have you here. I'm just teasing her. And she backed away from me, and suddenly her hands went into her pockets, and this thing came up, and I didn't understand what she had. And the phone rang. I went to the phone. It was Viva. I was talking on the phone. I said, here, talk to Andy about something, and I left that section. I went to the back of the studio, and suddenly the shots rang out.
No one in the factory was paying much attention when Solanus quietly slipped a .32 automatic from beneath her coat, aimed it at her tormentor, and fired. The first shot went wide, and though everyone in the 6th floor space heard the crack of gunfire, at first only Warhol himself clearly understood what was happening. No, Valerie, don't do it, he shouted, as she advanced towards him with the gun, shakily firing a second time, and again missing her mark.
She shot at Andy, and he was very sensible. He fell to the ground and actually hit his head on a corner of a desk, so he had a red mark here. And he laid on the ground as if he was shot. But she, being a little more crazy and clever, went up and put the gun up to his body.
As Warhol lay on the floor beneath a desk, Solanus deliberately approached to within a few feet, carefully took aim a 3rd time, and fired again. The bullet this time ripping into his right side, just below the 4th rib, tearing a path through 7 major organs before exiting from his back. I felt a horrible, horrible pain, he said, as if a firecracker had exploded inside of me. As gouts of blood splattered from Warhol's horrific wounds, Solanus turned her attention to a visiting art critic named Mario Amaya and fired off 2 more shots at point-blank range, striking him in the hip. Scrambling to his feet, the stunned Englishman somehow managed to leap into a tiny office at the back of the factory before she could fire again.
We closed the door between the front and back, and I could see through the window what was happening, and she was going to shoot Fred. Fred said, don't shoot me, Valerie. She said, I have to. It's so stupid.
As Solanus moved towards him with the gun, Hughes fell to his knees and pleaded with her to leave. She paused for a moment, turned away to call the elevator, then turned back, put the gun directly to Hughes' forehead, and prepared to pull the trigger. Before she could do so, the elevator door opened behind her, and Hughes, thinking swiftly, sternly commanded her to get in. There's the elevator, Valerie, he said. Just take it. For whatever reason, Solanus paused uncertainly for a moment, then obediently stepped into the empty car and fled, leaving behind a scene of bloody pandemonium.
I was in the dark room when I heard the shots, and when I got out, and up front, Andy was lying on the floor in a pool of blood. And people were like running around like chickens with their heads cut off, you know. So I went over and I picked him up in my arms, and he was still sort of conscious. And I was crying, and he said, oh, Billy, don't make me laugh. It hurts too much. You know, he was sort of getting delirious, like, too, you know, but he was still conscious in my arms then. But then he went out again, and I guess didn't come to until the hospital, and we didn't know if he was going to live or die. It was a real trauma because, from my point of view, someone I really loved was really hurt. and was dying.
It took 23 minutes from the time of the shooting for the ambulance to arrive. When it did, the two-man crew was unable to fit the stretcher into the cramped factory elevator and had to carry Warhol's profusely bleeding body down 6 flights of stairs to the street. Once in the ambulance, the dying artist lost consciousness completely, regaining it long enough in the emergency room at Columbus Hospital to hear one doctor say curtly to another, "No chance."
The doctors were standing over saying, well, this guy is DOA. We can't do anything for him. And Mario Amaya pops up, says, you can't let him die. He's a famous artist and he's rich. So they brought in this Italian specialist, and only because Mario was there.
Not long after arriving at the hospital, Warhol's life functions ceased, and a minute and a half later, he was pronounced clinically dead. But the lead surgeon, Dr. Giuseppe Rossi, realizing who his famous patient was, refused to give up, and cutting open Warhol's chest, massaged his heart until it began to respond, then set to work on a staggeringly complex operation that would take more than 5 hours to complete.
And all of his vital organs were pierced except his heart, and he was operated on for 5 hours by 5 doctors. One lung, the spleen, liver, kidneys, you name it, large intestines, small intestines. And afterwards, they told Paul Morrissey and Fred Hughes and Jed Johnson, he's probably not going to live. He's probably going to go into a state of shock when the anesthesia wears off because of the trauma of the shooting, followed by the trauma of this multiple operations, and probably lose him.
Well, we'd like to know, really, since he's still in a critical condition in that he's still being operated on, we'd like very much to know if his chances are improved now. It's a terribly shocking blow for us. He was a man we can only consider to be in the midst of life. He's there around us all the time. We see him and we know him and we talk to him. We feel his presence. He has a kind of magic presence, and that's partly why this kind of circumstance could have occurred. People were attracted to him. He had a kind of magical presence about him, a kind of sweetness and light that emerged from his character in all its shyness. And he had this kind of glow about him, which made him tremendously appealing as a person.
Around 4 a.m, Julia Warhol arrived at the hospital, looking drawn and grief-stricken, then returned to the Lexington Avenue townhouse, where she spent long hours praying for her youngest son, imploring God to spare his life and let him marry Viva.
You worked with Andy quite a lot. Did you know this girl?
Yes, I met her once or twice.
How would you describe her?
Mixed up.
How do you feel now?
Not very well.
4 hours after the shooting, Valerie Solanas surrendered herself to a traffic policeman near Times Square, handing over her guns and saying simply, "He had too much control over my life." For days, Warhol lingered on the borderline of life and death, passing in and out of consciousness, uncertain most of the time what was going on around him. He was in a deep delirium 2 days after the shooting, when the television in his room brought bewildering news of Robert Kennedy's assassination in the kitchen of a Los Angeles luxury hotel. It was also strange to me, he later recalled, this background of another shooting and a funeral. I couldn't distinguish between life and death yet anyway. And here was a person being buried on the television, right in front of me.
I wasn't sure if I was back. I felt dead. I kept thinking, I'm really dead. This is what it's like to be dead. You think you're alive, but you're dead. I just think I'm lying here in a hospital.
Finally, on July 28, 1968, after nearly 2 months in the hospital, Warhol returned home, but even then, remained housebound for weeks. In an eerie replay of his childhood, he spent hours sitting in bed, flipping through magazines, watching television, and talking on the phone. His scarred and shattered body, he told friends, looked like a Dior dress. But it's not that bad, he assured them. The scars look pretty in a funny way. It's just that they're a reminder that I'm still sick, and I don't know if I'll ever be well again.
I came to see that the event in Andy's life, apart from his discovery of who he was as an artist, which was very powerful when he hit it, the event was Valerie Solanas' attempt to murder him. The narrative was the rise to success. At the peak of that success, the breaking into it of horror, of someone who was crazy enough to wish him dead. And then the rest of his life, in some ways, facing down what he met that day. He had been told that while on the surgical table, his life functions had stopped briefly, and then they had been revived. He believed that he had died, and he had a fantasy, a theory, a belief about himself, which was that, as it were, at that moment, God decided to give him a second chance. He had died, but he took it back. And there was a deal that he could keep going for a while longer, but the deal could be rescinded at any time. And I think that he spent the rest of his life in some ways dealing with that fact.
On September 4th, Warhol appeared for the first time again in public at a party celebrating the completion of Midnight Cowboy, the John Schlesinger film that included in its climactic scene many regulars of the factory. Warhol spoke that evening with unusual candor to a reporter from the Village Voice.
Before I was shot, I always believed I was watching TV instead of living life. Right when I was being shot, I knew I was watching television. Since I was shot, everything is such a dream to me. I don't know whether or not I'm really alive, whether I died. It's sad. Life is a dream. I wasn't afraid before. And having died once, I shouldn't feel fear. But I'm afraid. I don't understand why. I'm afraid of God alone, and I wasn't before.
I'm here to tell you that Valerie turns Andy's life into a beautiful narrative of before and after. It's just the ghostly precision with which she cleaves his life into real Andy and posthumous Andy, any way you want to look at it. She makes vivid and actual all the scars that were already present, the holes, the punctures. Every issue in Andy's life and art, Valerie is an entrance to, and she's also a dramatic engine.
The great question after he'd been shot was there any way that he could continue to be Andy Warhol and fully move into a new phase? And that's a matter that has been greatly argued. He himself said many things indicating that he thought that in some ways it was over for him, that he was just imitating himself. But maybe that would be great too. Oh, it's so beautiful just to imitate yourself.
For nearly 18 months, Warhol himself seemed to be adrift, searching for a new direction, and to a large extent, failing to find one.
It's clearly traumatic. He can't work, he can't paint. In 1969, he starts painting again, but painting really doesn't begin to accelerate for a couple of years. His whole approach to the notion of the porousness of the studio changes too.
At the moment, what we seem to see reflected in that strange face is a sickness for which there may be no cure. Andy, in what one fervently hopes is just another put-on, begins to look more and more like the angel of death. Calvin Tompkins.
And then remarkably, little by little, he began to find his way, partly out of necessity, partly out of sheer instinct, as always following the current at the time. gathering himself and heading off into the new world of the 1970s, while most people were still reeling from the aftershocks of the 60s. In the years to come, with the help of a new entourage, he would reinvent himself once again, adapting and transforming the role he had taken on 20 years before when he first came to New York, that of the commercial artist. Isn't life a series of images that change as they repeat themselves? He himself would later say, looking back.
I started as a commercial artist, and I wanted to finish as a business artist. During the hippie era, people put down the idea of business. They'd say money is bad and working is bad. But making money is art, and working is art, and good business is the best art.
Really, Fred Hughes and Paul Morrissey together really turned Andy into a business. Fred turned the art business into a business, and Paul, made the movies into a business. And we were expected to keep fairly regular hours, not take drugs on the job. We saw this 60s factory as the enemy. They were the people we had to keep out, the drag queens and the speed freaks. Fred Hughes, Vincent Fremont, Pat Hackett, Jed Johnson, myself, Glenn O'Brien. We were kind of mostly from middle-class families. We had college education. And Andy would sometimes say, gee, you kids are so boring. I really miss those drag queens and speed freaks. They had so many more, they had ideas every minute. We'd say, well, if you want ideas every minute and you want to get shot again, fire us and bring them back.
For all the artistic ferment, the experiments of the 60s had never yielded much income. All that began to change in 1970, when Fred Hughes began to put into place a long-term strategy for increasing revenues and putting Warhol's artistic career on a solid business footing. He began by dipping into the unsold inventory of Warhol's pop paintings, taking advantage of the dramatic upturn in price that had occurred in the aftermath of the shooting. As the value of his work surged upward, Hughes urged Warhol to return to painting, not only to exploit the increasing interest in his pop art work, but to create silkscreen portraits of wealthy patrons. In return, lavish commissions Hughes would prove instrumental in securing. In the decade to come, Warhol's society portraits, often derided as artistic sellouts, would become the mainstay of the factory's rising financial fortunes and the centerpiece of an expanding business empire that would eventually push out in a dozen different directions.
The idea of it, it's a perfect model for sort of late 90s business. Horizontal, perpetual diversification. Today we're making a movie, tomorrow we're making a record, then we're starting a magazine, then we're doing this. The magazine supports the movies, the movie stars support the magazine, the portraits finance everything. And so basically Andy institutionalized himself.
In 1972, he put into motion his well-timed return to painting, beginning with a commissioned portrait calculated to reprise the shock of his early imagery. A silkscreen portrait of the leader of communist China, whose little red book, The Quotations of Chairman Mao, had become a minor bestseller that same year.
He worked with the famous image of Mao, which every Chinese school child had, and took that image and he defused it. So these paintings are fascinating for that, because here is this monster, but turned into this sort of effigy. And he was a fantastic colorist. And I think the Maos are particularly good in that respect. They've held up incredibly well. I think that the big ones are great, monumental, and have an overwhelming sense of scale. And the little ones are also very intense. They have extraordinary intensity.
By 1974, Warhol's commissioned portrait business was booming, charging $25,000 apiece for each original 40 by 40 inch canvas, with steep volume discounts if the client ordered multiple copies of the painting. He would bring in over $1 million in commissions that year alone.
They changed the face of portraiture. When you have this Polaroid with this hugely long lens, and you take a few Polaroids of you, and then, whatever it was, 2 or 3 weeks later, these magical images appeared. They turn the sitter into a star. And I think that's what Andy liked doing. I think he said everybody could be a star for 5 minutes or whatever it was. And I think that's what those portraits are about, in a way.
Andy probably did 1,000 portraits, and there was a scheme to that too in his head. Andy always insisted that every portrait be 40 by 40 inches. And he'd be perfectly okay when people said, you know, my living room is pink, and could you do some pink in my portrait? But if anyone said, could I make it a little bigger or a little smaller, he would not do it. It had to be 40 by 40. And once I said, Andy, why are you so insistent on the 40 by 40 thing? You know, sometimes people want it bigger or smaller. And he said, because I want one day to have an exhibition called Portrait of Society, and I want to have one of every person I painted in one big, you know, interlocking portrait, and he wanted it to be at the Metropolitan Museum. Even that was all thought out.
I think there is ample interpretive apparatus in his work to read as profoundly as you want anything he did in the 70s and 80s. His iconography is consistent and deep, and his technologies are consistent and deep. Tape recording, Polaroiding, capturing, cropping, silk screening, doctoring, repeating, all these techniques of time theft and capture remain the same. And so I think that Warhol needs to be taken as an artist of inclusiveness, multiplicity, maniacal productivity, and that the spectacle of all that and the interlocking meanings that are set into play by so much work juxtaposed with so much work makes him great, not an isolated body of work. And so that's behind my advocacy of the work of the 70s and the 80s. It's simply part of the vastly interesting spectrum of his various obsessive quests.
I think of him as Charles Dickens, you know. Started writing when he was 19, wrote till he was 50-something, fell over dead. You know, just one after the other. You know, I mean, it's about working. And I don't think he ever thought about anything else. You know, I think he went to the factory during the blackout. Sat there in the dark and opened the mail, you know. It's taking care of business.
The thing that I carry myself is the work ethic that he had. You hear about how he was distracted, and you hear about the discos, and you hear about the hangers-on, and you hear about so many different things. The guy never lost his focus. He always worked. And sometimes it was less good than at other times, but the work was always there. And I think finally, really, really provocative.
He always did such amazing work. He didn't, like so many artists, burn out. I mean, he went on. He was always trying out something new, and he was progressing and not standing still.
I think The Last Suppers, that last series of work, can you imagine, right at the end? I mean, still with a kind of resonance, still with a topicality, still with an energy, you know. The Last Supper paintings, I think, are glorious, simply glorious, and stand up to virtually anything he ever did.
Trust Andy, of course, not to use for The Last Supper the Leonardo or a photograph of the Leonardo in Milan, but to buy a really cheap three-dimensional kind of version of it, the tackiest kind, and use that as his image. And I think he did it brilliantly. I think Andy must have felt some sense of doom, of foreboding, because it's so curious that this came just before he died.
What did he die of? Andy went to New York Hospital for a gallbladder operation, which was necessary.
Andy was in denial about the pain he was having from his gallbladder in the last days of his life, because he did not want to go to a hospital. He always said, if I go to a hospital again, I'll die.
But when it got so painful, he finally agreed with all of the friends that he should go in, and they did let him die. And it wasn't because of the gallbladder, it was because of negligence.
He was basically overhydrated. They didn't watch the intake of fluids. So he basically died because of too much fluid. He slowly drowned in the middle of the night.
He didn't want to go in, and he knew he shouldn't go in, because they almost let him die last time, but this time they did let him die.
At 6:31 a.m. on the morning of February 22nd, 1987, Andy Warhol was officially pronounced dead, a victim of negligence, medical accident, and administrative oversight. He was 58 years old.
Dying is the most embarrassing thing that can ever happen to you, because someone's got to take care of all your details. You've died, and someone's got to take care of the body, make the funeral arrangements, pick out the casket and the service, and the cemetery, and the clothes for you to wear, and get someone to style you and do the makeup. You'd like to help them, and most of all, you'd like to do the whole thing yourself, but you're dead, so you can't. Here you've spent your whole life trying to make enough money to take care of yourself so you won't bother anybody else with your problems. And then you wind up dumping the biggest problem ever in somebody else's lap. It's a shame. I never understood why, when you died, you didn't just vanish, and everything could just keep going the way it was, only you just wouldn't be there.
He came from a family that could hardly help him out with his education, you know, and he just made everything on his own. And what he accomplished, you know, by having his picture on a stamp, I guess he'd be surprised, you know. In Pittsburgh, I don't know anybody else that ever had a picture on a stamp.
And when I went to the museum in Pittsburgh, when it finally opened, I could see his spirit running up and down the walls like waterfalls, you know. And I said, this is Andy's mausoleum. My God, he got where he should be, you know. And his spirit is living in this whole place.
His place, as far as I'm concerned, is assured. Among the most serious people in the art world, among the most thoughtful people in the art world, Picasso owns the first half of the 20th century, and Andy, without question, owns the second half. The artists that affect change, real change, are so few and far between. They're just incredibly valuable. They can't be replaced. They're unique. You have to adore these people. You have to adore them because they contribute so much to the culture, you know. They are the culture. But mind you, he was about breaking boundaries. Always, you know. I just celebrate the guy's genius.
Did you really say that everybody's going to be famous for 15 minutes?
Well, I think everybody is.
You didn't say that. You told me one time you didn't say that, actually.
No, I was just being funny. No, I said every 15 minutes someone will be famous, or every...
Next time on American Masters, meet Frank Gehry,
The leading architect in the world today.
and behold his astonishing buildings. See how he does it.
I call it a magic trick.
In Sketches of Frank Gehry, directed by Sidney Pollack on American Masters. To learn more about Andy Warhol, visit pbs.org. To order the Andy Warhol DVD or CD soundtrack, call 1-800-336-1917 or write to the address on your screen.
No, it's just great to be busy.
Mm-hmm.